Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going on a seriously fascinating journey to completely rethink how you approach learning. We're going to permanently debunk some of those pervasive memory myths you've probably heard a million times, and more importantly, we're building a real evidence-based toolkit for accelerated learning. These are practical, incredibly powerful techniques you can literally start using today.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've all had that fantasy, right? You're cramming for a huge exam or, prepping for a massive presentation at work, and you just wish you could stare at a page, take a mental snapshot, and effortlessly recall every single word later. It is pretty much the ultimate superpower, the photographic memory. But, well, there's a big question we have to answer right out of the gate. Is it actually real?
So, according to the research over at Eidetic, the idea of a true photographic memory, like a permanent, flawless snapshot in your brain, is a total myth. There is zero conclusive evidence that it exists in adults. Instead, our brains work a lot more like a giant jigsaw puzzle. When we recall past events or complex information, we aren't just pulling up a JPEG file on a hard drive. We're actually actively piecing things together from the specific fragments we managed to retain. We're really great at getting the general gist of things, but the exact details, we reconstruct those on the fly.
Which brings us to part 1, overcoming the memory bottleneck.
Since we know for sure we don't have a literal camera in our heads, we run into our very first major challenge. It's a biological bottleneck, and that bottleneck comes down to this number, 4. According to learning expert Dr. Barbara Oakley, our working memory, that's the short-term space where we process new information, can only hold a maximum of 4 chunks of information at any given time. That's it. When new inputs come flying in, your brain either has to automatically drop the old info to make room, or you have to use deliberate, focused mental effort to push it into long-term storage.
So how do we hack this? How do we bypass this limit? We do it through a brilliant cognitive strategy called chunking. Basically, chunking is the process of atomizing information into really small bits and then regrouping it into a meaningful whole based on internal patterns. And as the experts over at Sprouts point out, adding context to these new groups acts like memory superglue. It binds those 4 tiny limited slots into vast, connected networks of knowledge.
To actually do this in practice, you just follow these steps. You break the large piece down, you identify the patterns, you group them to see the big picture, and finally, you connect them to experiences you already have. Think of it kind of like learning to play a complex piece on the piano. A good teacher doesn't just tell you to play the whole song at once, right? No way. You listen to the whole thing first to get the mood, the big picture, and then you practice just one single measure at a time. Only when those individual chunks are totally mastered do you finally start connecting them together.
All right, moving on to part 2, active recall and spacing.
Now that we've figured out how to package the information, let's look at the daily engine of memory. And honestly, we need to expose a massive flaw in how most people study. I call it the productivity trap. Look, spending hours in beautiful note-taking apps, color-coding your outlines with highlighters, it feels incredibly productive, right? But as the folks at Memorang point out, if a tool doesn't actively force you to test yourself, it is literally just a note organizer wearing a memory costume. It's the total trap.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast in these results. A famous 2008 study showed that students who just passively reread their material remembered about 36% of it a week later. But the students who used active recall, meaning they tested themselves from a blank prompt, retained a massive 80%. Flashcard tools are absolutely the gold standard here because they force that uncomfortable but highly effective active recall. Plus, they handle spaced repetition, ensuring you review the material at systematically increasing intervals so it sticks.
Now, if you're a pen and paper kind of person and prefer physical cards over screens, you can totally do this manually. You use what Kwantlen Polytechnic University calls the box method, or the Lightner system. You physically move your flashcards into different boxes based on whether you got them right or wrong. Correct cards get reviewed less often, the ones you forget get moved right back to the daily review box. It's incredibly effective, but I'll warn you, tracking all of this manually can eventually turn into its own full-time job.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why software steps in to save the day. Digital flashcard apps, like Anki for example, completely remove the friction of manually tracking your review schedule. The software just synchronizes seamlessly across all your devices and automatically presents you with the exact items you need to review right before you are statistically about to forget them. You don't have to plan a thing.
And hey, there are plenty of great alternatives out there too. Things like Memorang, which offers a bunch of different quizzing formats and gamified features. Honestly, the specific app you choose matters a lot less than what the app makes you do. Finding the right digital tool removes every single logistical excuse around the core act of studying. It completely clears the runway so you can just sit down and focus on learning.
But if you're the kind of person who wants to optimize things even further, you've got to pay attention to the algorithm running under the hood. Most older apps default to a 1980s algorithm called SM2, but the newer platforms use something called the FSRS algorithm. Because FSRS predicts your actual forgetting curve so much more accurately, it can cut your daily review workload by 20 to 30% while giving you the exact same memory retention. To put that into perspective, over a year of learning, that is a staggering amount of saved time.
Next up, Part 3, the Feynman technique.
So, we've covered how to memorize raw facts and data. But what about grasping deep, highly complex theories? Well, this brings us to the legendary Nobel laureate physicist Richard Feynman. Farnham Street notes that his absolute secret to learning was rooted in one very simple, profound insight. Complexity and jargon often mask a lack of understanding. If you find yourself hiding behind big, complicated words, you don't actually know what you're talking about yet.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an actionable framework you can use. Step 1, pick a concept and write literally everything you know about it on a blank page. Step 2, explain it in words so incredibly simple that a 12-year-old would understand it. Step 3, when you inevitably stumble or get confused, go right back to the source material to review and refine those weak spots. And finally, test it by actually teaching it to someone else. Doing this exposes your knowledge gaps instantly.
Finally, Part 4, the method of Loci. Now for our absolute most advanced technique in the kit. This is a genuinely ancient method that's been revived for scaling up vast amounts of memory, and it is absolutely perfect for memorizing long sequences. It's called the method of Loci, though you probably know it today as the memory palace. This dates all the way back to Simonides of Chios in ancient Rome. It leverages our brain's incredibly powerful spatial memory. You take a familiar physical route, like, say, the layout of your childhood home, and you mentally place vivid, bizarre images representing the facts you want to learn at specific locations. Then, to retrieve the data, you just take a mental walk through the space.
Now, to understand exactly why these mental images need to be bizarre, just look at this wild excerpt from Thomas Harris's novel. He's describing the fictional serial killer Hannibal Lecter's memory palace. Lecter imagines Jesus driving a truck in a tutu. It sounds completely absurd, right? But that is exactly the point. Our brains will easily wash away a boring list of vocabulary words, but I promise you, you will never, ever forget a striking, ridiculous, or highly emotional image.
And you know, this ancient spatial framework is literally everywhere in modern pop culture. Think about it. When you see brilliant fictional minds like Patrick Jane in The Mentalist, or Sherlock Holmes, or Dr. Sean Murphy in The Good Doctor, pulling impossible, obscure details out of thin air, they aren't just using magic. The writers are specifically depicting them using the exact same method of loci that real-life memory champions use every single day.
So, the crucial point is this, and it's beautifully summarized by the author at Imprimo. The tool is a lever, not a magic wand. Whether you're relying on a cutting-edge algorithm on your smartphone or an ancient Roman memory palace inside your mind, no app or technique is going to memorize the material for you. You still have to sit down, focus, and do the uncomfortable but incredibly rewarding work of recalling that information out of your own head.
But hey, now the friction is entirely gone. You aren't fighting your biology anymore, you're finally working with it. You now have the ultimate evidence-based toolkit for accelerated learning. You know how to chunk data, how to automate your spaced active recall, how to simplify the complex like Feynman, and how to build a vast memory palace. The only question left for us is, what are you going to master next?